Good evening, everyone. My name is Jennifer Withrow. I am the head of exhibitions and publications at the McMichael. I'm so glad to welcome you this evening to what I know is going to be a very special hour, occasioned by the opening of our latest exhibition called The Uses of Enchantment, Art, and Environmentalism at the McMichael. I will begin with a land acknowledgement. The McMichael Canadian Art Collection is located on the original lands of the Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, and Huron-Wendat people. It is uniquely situated along the Carrying Place Trail, which historically provided an integral connection for Indigenous peoples between Ontario's lakeshore and the Lake Simcoe-Georgian Bay region. As an institution, the McMichael recognizes the importance of acknowledging the original territories of the Ojibwe, Anishinaabe First Nations people, the Wendat, Huron-Wendat people, and other Indigenous nations. So before we begin our program tonight, I want to just say a few quick things. Those of you who have joined us in a webinar of this nature will be familiar with these. First, we are recording this talk. So if you're thinking of a friend and or family member who would have loved to join us, direct them to our YouTube channel where the recording of this conversation will land in a few days. Secondly, we've reserved time at the end of this program for questions. So if you have a question for any of our panelists, put it in the chat button, press the chat button or the Q&A button. I'll gather those up in the background over the course of the hour, and then we'll try to get to as many as we can at the close of the slideshow. Thirdly, I must thank the generous supporters of this exhibition and the accompanying publication. We have many supporters who help allow us to dream big with our exhibitions. And so I would like to take a little time to tell you that we've had support for the show and the publication from Make Way, from Dragonfly Ventures, from Michael and Honor DePensier, from Roz and Andy Heinzman, from Peter Goring, and from Erica Shuttleworth. So thank you so much to all of those people and entities for sort of linking arms with us for this exhibition. We love to do talks in the connection with our exhibition program and making those free to audiences across Canada and beyond. But we can only do this with the support of those who share our view that Canadian art deserves the world-class treatment. So maybe you're already a member of the museum. If you're not, I urge you to consider joining our family of supporters. We make it very easy on our website with a little button marked join. Members get advance notice of all of our goings on and invitation to special occasions and free admission to the museum. Coming to visit us is a great way to support us. We're open Tuesday to Sunday. This exhibition opened last week and it is open all summer and for the beginning of fall. So please come and see the show and consider buying the book that goes with it. I will briefly introduce each of our panelists and guests. They all have so many successes and accolades, but in the interest of moving along and getting to our program, I will just summarize and say a few brief things about them. Beginning with our Chief Curator, Sarah Milroy. Many of you will know Sarah already. She is one of the country's most respected public voices and champions of Canadian art. She's been our Chief Curator at McMichael since 2018, and in that time has curated or co-curated dozens of exhibitions, large and small, for us, including Uninvited, Canadian Women Artists in the Modern Moment, which is on display at the National Gallery of Canada all summer. For our panelists this evening, three artists whose work forms a part of the Uses of Enchantment in alphabetical order. I'll begin with Carrie Allison. She is of Nehiu, Cree, Métis, and mixed European descent. She's a multidisciplinary visual artist based in Halifax with a master's in fine art from the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design University. Her practice responds to ancestry, thinking through intergenerational cultural loss and acts of reclaiming, resilience, and resistance, while also thinking through notions of allyship, kinship, and visiting. Shary Boyle works across diverse media, including sculpture, drawing, installation, and performance. With an honorary doctorate of fine arts from OCAD University, her work considers the social history of figurines, animist mythologies, antiquated technologies, and folk art forms to create symbolic, politically charged language that is uniquely her own. Winnie Truong is a Toronto-based artist working with drawing and animation. With a BFA from OCAD University, her work explores ideas of identity, feminism, and fantasy, and finding connections and transgressions in the natural world. Truong's process has evolved to include more play and dimensionality, pushing her two-dimensional forms toward the third dimension with constructed dioramas. So I am a big fan of all three of these artists, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion that they will have with Sarah tonight. So I pass the baton to you, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Jen. Yeah, it's a really wonderful group of artists that are gathered together in this exhibition, and I want to start by, of course, thank you all for joining us, but also to explaining a little bit. Normally, we're much more declarative and straightforward in the titles for our exhibitions at the McMichael. This one, The Uses of Enchantment, is a bit of an outlier in that regard because it's a little bit oblique. But I wanted to explain that it comes out of a book that was written by a psychologist, Bruno Bettelheim, who was Austrian US academic. And he wrote this book about fairy tales. And Bettelheim's contention in this book is that fairy tales are important because they give you a space in which, for children, in which they can imagine really the very worst things that could happen. So we know, I mean, it's sometimes troubling, and traditional fairy tales, the mother will die, or there's an evil, stepmother who's, a persecutor, or there's, as we see in the picture on the cover, there's a wolf in the bed where there should be a grandmother, and, things are not what they seem. And it's a very dangerous world. And yet, Bettelheim's thought was that through fairy tales, young people can kind of confront their worst fears and kind of come to some kind of reckoning, come to some kind of stable place with it. And I came across this book 40 years ago when I was a student of literature at McGill, and it just made this very big impression on me, certainly as I was raising my own children. And then as I started to move into the 80s and 90s, I realized that there were artists that I was aware of in the art world that were engaging with climate change and with environmental collapse and species loss in ways that were both, dealing head on with the kind of existential challenges we face, but we're doing so in a language that was very, very rich and beautiful, and actually enchanting would be the word for it. So I would have to say, Shary, that one of the first artists that I saw working in that way was you. And so we'll get to your work in a minute, but I just want to show you first some of the other artists that are in the show. We did an event at the gallery last weekend where we talked to Sarah Angelucci and to Bill Burns about their works that are in the show. But I want to, for the benefit of the audience tonight, just introduce their work quickly. Sarah Angelucci made this series of works that are kind of hybridizing between bird photographs of endangered and extinct birds with 19th century carte de visite, which already, which were kind of calling cards in polite society in 19th century France. There's something when you come across these carte de visite in flea shops and stuff in Paris or in New York, there's something morbid about them because these people on these carte de visite, of course, are long gone in time. And I think that, this is the quality of photography generally, is that it feels like evidence of something that time has pulled away from us. So I think Sarah had this ingenious insight to kind of braid these images together in these extraordinary works, which have this very, very striking presence in the gallery. And what she's done is, what we've done in the gallery is to put on audio in this gallery another performance that she created, an audio work called Morning Chorus, MOURNING, in which she trained professional singers to sing the songs or interpret the songs and sing them of extinct and threatened songbirds. So you walk into the gallery, you see these on the wall. And you hear these strange cries and moaning and sighing sounds of these, the chirping sounds and so on of these birds. And we've had an interesting problem at the gallery in the past week. Jen, I don't know if you were on that email loop, but the security guards at the gallery are like you have to turn the sound off this piece at night because our people are going through the gallery in the dark with a flashlight, and they don't want to walk through those galleries at night and down the ramp because it's really very eerie and evocative. So we're trying to deal with that technical problem, but it's an incredible experience in the show. And that sound sort of spills over into the show as a whole and creates this sort of mood of lamentation, which is very, very beautiful, I think. We also show, in a somewhat more comic vein, perhaps, Bill Burns's series devoted to safety gear for small animals. And this is a series of drawings and sculptures and other things that he's made around this theme of creating little gloves or visors or respirators for animals that are in the wild. So there'll be a respirator for a moose, or, work gloves for a raccoon, and earmuffs for, a frog that is being afflicted by sound pollution. So, he does extensive research on animals and the plights that they are facing in the environment, and then makes this kind of conjectural inventory of accessories through which these animals could live more comfortably in their changed habitats. And of course, it is an absurdist gesture because, of course, you can't actually put earmuffs on a grasshopper or UV goggles on a bee, but his research will show that these are the parts of these very vulnerable creatures that are being threatened. And it's a way, I've come to understand Bill's work as being really about that feeling we all have of futility, of like, what can one individual do? And obviously making tiny little UV goggles for a bee. He confesses that the only animal he's ever tried the safety gear on is his cat, and it was not a success. But it's obviously a kind of flight of fancy, and it's a sustained 3 decades of work on this idea. And we're showing a selection of the safety gear and of these beautiful drawings in the show. And they are, it's wonderful because they're installed in the gallery beside huge pane of glass that, looks out into the woods where you see squirrels running up and down and so on. So it's a uniquely perfect context for showing this work in. We're also showing works by Havival Manumi, who's a senior artist in King 8, which used to be called Cape Dorset in the north. And he's made a number of works that deal with the natural world. He often deals with animals that are kind of hybridizing, where different beings are kind of coming together, which sort of speak of the interconnectedness of all things, but also of birds and fish and whales and other marine mammals that are bound up in these nets, which are the sort of residua of commercial fishing, washing up in the Arctic in great numbers, apparently. And a work such as this is sort of speaking to the dysfunctional relationship between humans, resource extraction and the natural world. So these are some of the artists that that are in the exhibition, alongside the artists that you'll meet tonight. But I wanted to start, Shary, with you tonight because it was your work that actually got me thinking years ago about fairy tale and fantasy and this language of enchantment that you bring to, you've been making work about the environment for decades now. And I don't remember it being a subject that was of considerable focus to other artists when you were sort of pioneering this work back in the day. So I just wanted to ask you maybe to start by, how did you come to really, was there a pivot point that made you want to engage with this kind of subject matter? And maybe, we're moving here from Havival to your take on a Sedna figure, and which is quite distinct from a European mermaid figure. So anyway, I haven't really asked you a question. I'm just kind of like saying.
I'm tracking all those skeins of wool that you're tossing out like a kitten.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for noticing. I guess when you talk about fairy tale, I think about mythology or folklore or oral traditions of cultures from all over the world. And I've been thinking so much in the last year or two how incredibly potent story is to the human brain. I think it might be the most powerful kind of almost addictive source that we have as in culture as humans. I never really understood how powerful it was until I really examine the internet for many years and see how it operates on us and how susceptible we are in it. So of course it makes sense that mythology or folktale or fairy tale, religion, all of these kind of story-based ideas are so powerful to us and really kind of can change the ways we think and the way we operate and move through the world. So I guess I've always had a connection to the narrative. And when it comes to the idea of nature, which is also a concept that's kind of a European idea of nature or the landscape, right? Or I feel from a young age, I've never made a distinction between the creatures in the world and the humans in the world, or anything that lives and grows seems to me of the same spirit and energy and matter as a human being. So that boundary has been very gray. There has not been in my imagination a boundary between those things.
Yeah.
I also was raised on kind of European folk tales or fairy tales, Hans Christian Andersen, Little Mermaid being a very early one. I remember my mother reading me the original version, which was quite violent and disturbing, not like the Disney version. And so when I was invited to work in Kingate in 2011, and I went up to draw with the artists at that time in the studio, I was wanting to bring my traditions as a settler, European, history of the mermaid, which I grew up with as a mythological creature, this kind of powerful, mysterious woman of the sea, and bring it up to work on it as an idea, as a kind of image that was so powerful and profound to me in a cultural context that was so not my own, that had a parallel figure in Sedna or Nuliak or different names for her across the Arctic. And I just wanted to use that almost like a basis of exchange instead of language. Instead of the English language, I wanted to bring up imagery as a kind of sovereign tool that people might be able to relate to and have a comparative experience with side-by-side drawing. So my thought was already in 2011, thinking about the melting ice caps and the amount of pollution going on in the sea, the plastics being found and all the sea animals up there that were directly translating into people's bodies through, and through eating seafood and ending up in cancer and different health issues. So those things, the integration of animal and human and land, it's not just some fantasy, it's reality. We are the same thing. So, we see that when people have, a cancer from the food that they're eating, which is a natural, fresh food. So for me, I was thinking about, this is not actually supposed to be Sedna because I didn't feel like I could have claim to drawings, making images of Sedna. I was making images of, in my imagination, of a Hans Christian kind of mermaid, but thinking, what about the pollution and the oil, that the residuals that are just kind of clogging the sea, and also the offshore drilling that's constantly being threatened up there. So that's kind of what I started off as in this particular image.
So here she is, drunk on oil.
8 years later, the title Black Gold is kind of lifted from a song of Simone Schmitz, who at the time was working as a fiver musician coming from Toronto, and their music and lyrics are really, really powerful and really based in kind of an activist sensibility, and always has used narrative in a really profound way for pushing forward really important ways of thinking and causes. And so in that particular song, Black Gold from 2015 album, I think, they were speaking about bitumen and the tar sands. That was what the song is about, using kind of a narrative device to explore those environmental and kind of human impacts on the people that work there and the people that live there and the people whose land is being extracted. So this came to me, I was on a residency in Norway, which is an interesting place because it also has a really strong connection to oil extraction and fisheries. And their fish farms are, very throughout Canada waters, and they're kind of the perpetuators of salmon fish farms in our West Coast or East Coast in the Atlantic, and which have wreaked havoc on the natural salmon and West Coast salmon natural runs. So I was just thinking about the kind of drunkenness of the addiction that we have to fossil fuels and the complete inability to get off them. So I guess
tell me about this morphology of this body. Like, how did you?
Yeah, the distortion, I guess, for like metaphor and symbology comes to me fairly naturally. It's the way my mind works with image. And so for me, the kind of distortion and the scale that's so wrong and kind of liquid, and it's like a dreamscape in the way that things kind of swell and decline in the liminal state of sleep, but it's also showing the kind of almost like a grotesquerie of the exaggeration of the way that we've kind of extracted past reason, past measure on every level of our kind of overpopulation of the earth. So it seemed to me a natural way to talk about that subject.
And this work we had to really dig to find, Shary, because you had it deeply tucked away somewhere. And I'm so glad that we were finally able to find it, because it just feels like this work is something we're seeing on the evening news.
Yeah, it's funny. I really love this piece. It was a long time ago that I made it. And it's
2007.
pretty big work in black ink, which I've, is my main way of drawing. But yeah, it's just, complete chaos, total chaos, right? And it seems to be kind of, I don't know, no historical kind of specific. I mean, chaos is a part of construction, destruction. It's part of the system of life on Earth, I guess, death and rebirth. But in this particular case, it just seems like of some kind of violent act that people are finally forced to run from. And it is amazing. I mean, I don't want to be, we must like practice hope in despair, but yeah, sometimes it does feel like it's only through catastrophe that humans act.
Pay attention. Yeah. So this is a picture for Alberta. Like
everywhere, floods, fires. Here's a flood that I was reading about I think it was happening in France in 2007. Around that time, there was a pretty big flood in Paris, which was impacting or threatening the vaults of some of the big museums there, like the Louvre. And of course, it led me to imagine all sorts of things about these antiquated sculptures and kind of antiquated empires that created, collected, and preserved these sculptures, and what their relevance is in the time of, mass environmental destruction, and would they be preserved? What happens when kind of European empires attempt to keep hold of the past to all kind of
or not change
measure of the future, right? Like how
not adapt.
How much can be salvaged? If you look closely at this picture, there's tiny little people on the boat. There's like little tiny people that are so small in scale that are kind of pulling it through. Yeah, like there's someone standing there and one on the last boat sitting down over the edge. And I imagine them almost like looters of an apocalyptical future.
It's extraordinary work. I remember when I first saw it. So, this, I mean, what I guess one of the things I find myself thinking about when I first saw these things, they seemed like they were talking about things that were collectively understood. Like we knew we were in a climate crisis. It didn't seem like these were not the first time that I was presented with these ideas. Obviously, it was like, I was reading The End of Nature by Bill McKibben, I think was back in the 70s, possibly. But what I'm amazed is how this is 2007, we're now 23, and how little things have actually advanced in all these years that you've been making this work.
Yeah. And again, this is a title inspired by Rebecca Solnit, who's done so much beautiful advocacy and writing about environmental activism and kind of ways to carry on hope amongst that kind of feeling that nothing is changing, or that we're dealing with the same things over and over again in massive movements. They're called, I guess, movements because they are moving, even though it seems glacial to anybody that feels very stuck in them. But in the big picture, things are moving and things are changing very, very slowly. And unfortunately, like I said, it often, changes the most when you see great violence, which is so tragic. And I guess that this piece is kind of about that. Moths drink tears is just a small phrase that I picked up out of like a little fragment out of one of her writings. I think it was in, I can't remember which book it was, but moths do drink tears of animals. They can be found drinking the salt out of the tears of certain animals. I thought that was incredibly beautiful and poetic. But this piece is about that life cycle of despair and kind of passivity and inactivity, almost as a paralysis. And then what happens out of it is that great violence or even a death of some sort. But as all forms of nature, and the marvel of the natural world is its
Comes out of it.
reanimation, of how it will spring out of death and life, and that it feeds itself and it feeds each other, and it kind of like a nurse tree will have small trees feeding on it for generations, so there's always this endless gift of cycling through death and life. And this was a piece that I was trying to find that hope in the cycle.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Here's one of my favorite little guys, White Fright, which is, I know bats are very close to your heart, Shary, because we've talked about them. If anyone is interested in hearing Shary's full thoughts about bats, at the beginning of COVID, we did a wonderful talk together where Shary defended the bat from all naysayers who were blaming everything on bats at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. And, bats have actually figured in your work quite a bit. And I wanted to just, we have this piece on view in the gallery, and this shows you really what makes it so extraordinary is the delicacy of the making. So here's this kind of much maligned creature that you're elevating in the most exquisite way. So maybe give us a little sense of bats, their place in the world, and why you extol their beauty the way that you do.
Maybe, I guess the bats are just such a perfect character to consider how North America, say, because that's the culture that I'm socialized in, has maligned and ignored nature based on, the Christian kind of principles of white Canada, say, around man's dominion over nature, which is a false kind of paradigm. But the way that people have dismissed bats or maligned bats as a nuisance or something that is, creepy, or an animal that people don't like, they're source of phobia, or like a pest that you have to call somebody to get rid out of your attic. And then over time there's been a mass wipeout of bats. Around 2007, the white nose fungus started across the eastern part of the continent and swept all the way across, killing millions of little brown nose bats, which are absolutely key species in the ecosystem of eating insects and kind of fertilizing and all manners of importance to all the rest of the systems that rely on them, as we do ourselves. So my idea for making this lace draped porcelain bat was to just comment on the fragility of this ecosystem and how indebted we are to it, and also to pay the care and homage deserving to this beautiful creature through something as meticulous and finely made as and fragile as porcelain lace, that is really is lace dipped in liquid porcelain and then fired in the kiln so that the lace itself disappears. That what you're looking at is 100% porcelain, which means it doesn't take much just to put a finger through that and break it completely, which asks people to please take great care with you know, the artwork. But it really, what does it matter? It's just an artwork in the big picture. It's the ecosystem that's the important part.
So the work becomes a metaphor for care more generally. Yeah. And I think that's a really nice link through to what Carrie is doing. So thank you, Shary. I'm just going to move to Carrie Allison, who is an artist who is newer to me, Shary, than you are. But Carrie, I had a great steer one morning in Halifax when I was visiting with Jan Peacock, who is the writer on your work in this catalog. And Jan was saying, you know, before you leave town, you should go and see Carrie Allison's exhibition at the Nova Scotia Museum. So I went on that rainy morning and had just this fabulous encounter with these works, and also some works that you'd made mapping rivers, which were also very beautiful, that were in that show. And those works really stuck in my mind, and it started to kind of stick together with Shary's work and with other artists that I was thinking about, with this idea of devotional attention to something that is normally not particularly cherished, which is like weeds, or what we would call weeds, but that we need to even look at that terminology of what is a weed and what is not a weed. And I know you'll take us through that, but can you start by telling us like how you became interested in plant life? And, you know, I understand that you had a residency in South Africa that was very important to you. Can you sort of take us back to the beginning of your engagement with this subject matter and lead us forward to these beautiful beaded botanicals?
Yeah. I mean, my relationship with plants has always been one of fascination and one of admiration. My grandparents had an amazing garden when I was growing up. They had like a property in the suburbs, but their entire property had a beautiful kept garden. In the back, they had a huge vegetable and fruit garden.
Was this in Halifax, or where was this?
It was in BC, actually. Yeah. So so I grew up on Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations territory. My grandmother moved there from High Prairie after residential school. So she moved out west with my grandfather, and then had my mom, and then I was born there as well. But yeah, I didn't go to Nova Scotia until 2010, or I didn't come to Nova Scotia until 2010. But yeah, they had like an amazing garden, which I always loved going around in. I regret not learning as much as I should have about it, about like growing things. My grandmother passed and my grandfather is not well, so I regret that. But I've always had like a love for plants and love for nature. I had a great boyfriend in high school who him and I like we would garden together, which was like not something that you typically did at like 15 and 16.
High school.
Yeah, it was really lovely. And his parents were always like really like they would go out and like buy us plants. And that was like what we did on like a Sunday was we would go to like the nursery and get plants in the summer. And they really like built that up, and it was really nice. So I think I just had like lovely people in my life that also liked plants. And then yes, I've always kind of made work with plants in mind. I think that they're like this really lovely subject to contemplate, and I think they tell stories through the landscape, like whether they're there, whether they're not there, what plants are there, the paths
And how
that
do
are
they travel? Yeah. And how do they travel around the world? Because I know one of your great interests is the ways in which Indigenous species are, come to be threatened by invasive non-Indigenous species, and the kind of, can you talk a little bit about the colonial implications of how plants thrive or don't in the world we're in?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in any regard. I'm very like interested in the sense that I like to read books and I like to look at things. So I went to South Africa and I was really thinking about colonial histories living on the landscape and like how colonialism has affected plants in general. So I would go to botanical gardens and I would look and just kind of like seeing which plants were kind of cultivated to be there and then which plants were kind of like taking over on highways and stuff. And because South Africa is so fruitful, it was really easy for certain plants to thrive. So there's like certain, I can't remember their names. I'm very bad with like scientific names. I feel like my brain just like purposely like forgets them because they're convoluted and and they always have to do with like a white guy with his like name. So like
yes.
But there's these plants that have been brought over specifically to just like ornate and decorate people's lawns, and then they just like took over like massive landscapes. And have pushed Indigenous plants to the side and or have made like it very difficult for those plants to grow in the atmosphere or in the environment that they have always typically grown in. And so that was something that I was thinking about when I was in South Africa, and I made a series called Botany Colonized that kind of like thought through that and thought about it through material. And so I've always had like a love and an admiration for plants. And and I started beading in 2017. So honestly, like a year before I started this piece. So it wasn't.
So this is your maiden voyage. Well,
yeah, well,
I mean,
you saw the rivers. The rivers were kind of like my
first go.
Yeah,
I mean, it's the things that, just to get to this this particular series, I'm just going to take us to the next slide. You can see how fine the beadwork here is, where you're taking something, you're taking a plant specimen from the Nova Scotia Museum. And, I think what's so striking about it is the way in which that representation is shattered, and in which there are blanks, there's blank spaces, and it does evoke a feeling of distress or erasure. And yet the remains are attended to with such devotional care. There's a great tenderness, I feel like, to this work. So how did you learn how to do beadwork of this fineness so quickly? I'm intrigued.
I learned from lots of different people. I've had like lots of different teachers kind of teach me on the way, but I started with like YouTube videos because it was accessible to me. And like I remember bringing this to a beading symposium, like the first beading symposium in Toronto, and like showing people what I was working on. And it wasn't this particular piece, but it was something one of them within the series. And because I was trained within like the like Western institution in drawing and painting, they're very different than like the people that I was surrounded with, because the people that I was surrounded with were people that were making within communities and like had their families designs and methods, and I didn't really have that, so I was kind of making that up as I went along. And so it's really makeshift in a lot of ways. Like I think that like these stitches are not like typical
You
stitches that
kind
you
of
would
made them up. Yeah, yeah.
a little
yeah.
bit. There are obviously like the gesture is still there, which I think a lot about the gesture. I think a lot about like how the gesture of sewing connects me to my ancestors, and it'll connect me to like future ancestors too. And so I think about that a lot when I'm beading. And I also do think that beading is a way to spend time and honor
Yeah.
specific beings. So like in this case, like with this whole series, I was really sad that all of these pieces were in an archive and
Mhm.
in these drawers and never seeing the light of day. And they aren't like taken out. Like I had gone to the museum numerous times throughout the years and never saw the botanical
Never seen
collection.
them.
Because it's not typical. Like it's not typical for them to put it on view because I don't know what I think that they're beautiful and
Well, they're
interesting.
also, this is the irony of the museum's mandate to preserve, because they're excruciatingly sensitive to light and
Yeah,
damaged by light. So, like we're saving them, but like for what? For no eyes to fall upon them. It's like it's
yeah,
a conversation we have a lot at the museum,
yeah.
because of course conservators need to their highest objective is to preserve things,
Mhm.
for posterity. But you've been able to deploy these plant specimens now both in Nova Scotia and in our exhibitions, so we're very grateful for that. We understand what a rare opportunity that is. And the breaks in these plants, but in these beaded, is this signifying to you a kind of erasure of these species? Are these species largely under threat,
Yeah, so
or
all
you
of
scared?
these,
Yeah.
all of the plants that I decided to include are plants that are under threat
Yeah.
from like human interference. So whether that's like the urban sprawl, forestation or deforestation, or just like general trampling.
Mm.
They're all plants that are being affected by like us and just not taking care.
Mhm.
Um, and so, yeah, I fragmented them in order to kind of symbolize that history and that reality that these plants are disappearing from our landscapes, and we should probably like think about them in a way that can help them in some way.
Mhm. I think, there's something about the way you're venerating the individual. Like you have there's a passage in Jan Peacock's essay in which she talks about the lawn, the kind of green cultivated monoculture of grass, as opposed to this, and the kind of politics of conformity around everyone needing to have exactly the same vegetation growing in front of their house. And so I actually feel like there's something kind of delicately militant about the way that you are insisting on the value of these things that are identified as weeds in the vernacular of our culture in North America.
Yeah. I mean, I'm obsessed with lawns, like really, really, really badly. I live in like a cul-de-sac, and I think it's so weird that all the men that are like live here are just like outside, like tending to their lawns, and it's
Mhm.
considered work. And then like
Yes.
me tending to my garden is considered like a hobby.
Mhm.
Or right now I'm working on like a large grass project where I'm like basically I'm beating these little plots of grass.
Mm.
And I showed my neighbor because I'm actually really good friends with my neighbor. He has a very beautiful
Yeah.
lawn, and I think that it's like very funny. But he came over and I was working on this, and I'm sitting there and I'm making these like, they're like very tedious to do because it's you're essentially making a fringe, and then you're going back down, and so you're making like
Mhm.
a little line of beads, which is interpreted through like as a line of or a blade of grass. And so
Yes.
he's looking at me and he was like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "I'm making a plot of grass out of beads." And he's just like, "You're crazy. Like, why would you do that?" And I'm like, "This is how I feel about you going outside and like weeding and like,
Obsessing about your lawn.
yeah, like I'm just like, this is how I feel." And I was like, "But like,
How
I
big
can
is this?
actually,
How big is this work, Carrie?
I'm making 6 1x1s or 1 feet by
Okay.
1 feet. And then
Okay.
dreaming about making a bigger one, but it's so time
Labor
consuming.
intensive.
Yeah,
Insane.
but
No dandelions allowed?
yeah, it would be great to make one. I've definitely, yeah, I've been thinking about just like how I want to work on like a larger sort of exhibition or work to do with. I just want like a whole exhibition to do with grass because I think it's so funny and kind of like boring, but amazing.
Yeah, but it is indicative of a deeper problem with our relationship to the natural world and the social pressure. I mean, we'll move on here, but the social pressure, if you don't maintain your lawn a certain way, that it's
Yeah,
like a thing in your community. You know, I know my daughter's street in Leslieville is like there's some renegade households that are just refusing to comply with this expectation. And it's actually like your, failure to maintain your lawn is actually affecting my market value of my home and this kind of crazy stuff. So
yeah,
you're onto a subject that's really got deep, if you'll pardon the expression, deep roots in the culture and what's wrong with how
yeah.
we coexist with nature. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Fascinating.
super interesting. It has, and like it
It
has like
really
such a
is.
big history too with
Yeah.
colonialism and like
Yes.
how we keep ourselves. It's
Yeah.
weird.
And how we well, it's the ultimate expression of this notion of mastery over nature. Like it is natural, it's grass, but it will do as it's told.
Hmm.
We will be in charge of it. And that's, the man on the John Deere tractor, like mowing the lawn is like kind of, there is a link there to patriarchy, but we won't go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Carrie. I'm just here's another beautiful detail just to show you the really exquisite fineness of the work. I'll never forget running into these works that morning. They're, as we say, enchanting in this show. And then finally, your work is really, Carrie, dealing with weeds and things being broken and fractured and under duress and yet venerated. But Winnie, who is, I think, the youngest artist in the show, is giving us a vision of sort of the vegetal world that is like rampant and luxuriant. And I think, Winnie, I'm correct in saying that what you're imagining here is a kind of utopia in which growth and fertility and fecundity is allowing for this kind of fusion between human beings and the natural world. And it's kind of a healing of that split between the human and the non-human. Am I in the zone?
Yeah. And, I feel like even within my own mind that it really depends on where I am on the scale of optimism about the future as I extend myself further into reality or into the supernatural and world of my own making. And that's sort of where these dioramas are coming from. So I think for me, they're just emerging from the sort of wanting of world building or to create this reality that kind of extracts us from the built environment that we're used to, and I guess the weight of environmental collapse that feels imminent. And
I should point out, I think,
yeah,
just because we're not in the gallery, we're looking at this on a flat screen, is that these are richly three-dimensional works. And when I first knew your work a few years ago, it was drawings that were also spectacular, often featuring very elaborate hair. It seems like the memory of that hair is still here somehow in these landscapes that you're creating. But then you broke into this dimension of having layers of drawing that was cut out and very delicately assembled. Can you talk about making that shift from the flat picture plane into this dimension?
Yeah, I mean, my previous work, I guess it's still, the new work still retains a lot of that sort of muscle memory of the drawn line. And, it's still very much about drawing and how to sort of push the possibilities of work on paper beyond this sort of fragile and two-dimensional limitation, and taking these really humble materials and taking them into, large dimensions, physically, or newer dimensions, I guess three-dimensionally. So yeah, the whole previous work was more about the idea of hair being this indicator of, everything from gender to society. And I mean, hair is, how we adorn it is imbued with all these different conversations about class and beauty. And the moment it is slightly removed from the body, it has these sort of abject inferences. And so as the work evolved, it was about using hair as a subject matter, and kind of reaching what we feel is comfortable and what is normal, and kind of, I guess, perverting our ideas, or our heavily coded ideas about beauty standards, especially Western beauty standards. And so the new work takes a lot of these ideas of the sort of like femme body, and to me, they're very sensual, they're bulbous and robust, but they're also anatomically unwell or unusual.
Distorted. Like there is this element, and I'm thinking of some of the other works that are by Shary that are in the show, the sculptural works. There is an element of the grotesque, or at least it seems that way, when compared to like our conventionalized beauty standards. So it's almost like you're being, a demand is being made on you to accept the beauty of these forms that are deviant from norms.
And I mean, so as we go along, like the works are all sort of created within the same period as well. And I really do see them as these sort of things that sort of exist in the vacuum of these environments. So if you think about them as these little vitrines or terrariums of these, like, because they are these works on paper that have these botanical elements that I love creating these. And since I've turned to this body of work, there is this sort of delicacy and play and just immersion and devotion to, I guess, replicating these impressions of nature. So seeing Carrie's work with the embroidery is the wanting of capturing that is very familiar to me as well. That sort of exploration with these specimens, whereas mine are a bit more on the imaginary side.
Yeah, it strikes me. I just wanted to zoom into this close up here because it just seems like, so visually inventive. And again, I think this is, something I see as you sharing, very much with Shary's work, is this kind of hovering on the edge of the grotesque and also creating these kind of hybrid forms that are morphing. And I think, when I look at the work too, and the prevalence of the female body in the work, and, the fetus, part of the woman's body as she, prepares to give birth and so on, and this fruit-like eyeball, is the work gendered? Like, talk to us about the work being gendered in this female-oriented way.
Yeah, I mean, if we take the whole series and just my own interior thinking about the sort of world building, like I've spoken to this with you and probably with others before, that I'm imagining this world sort of emerging from like a different primordial soup just outside of our possibilities. So if we change a few biological factors even from the beginning, or does this come, after the fall and we're rebuilding from that same matter, to imagine this world without that patriarchal gaze, and how that would even evolve into the botanical elements being, obviously that sort of world, the natural world, is already gendered in how they reproduce. It's not all asexual fragmentation, budding of cutting stalks and planting them here. There is a sort of pollination category that we can examine. But within the previous piece of self-sown, like I imagine that in particular as what could be this sort of self-rooting process that would create this a more humanoid or, human vessel, and what sort of plant vessels or hybrid structures could be used to create this whole cycle. So, as you kind of go along, there is this sort of fruit bearing element to it. There's this tiny strawberry like element on the lower left hand, and the
Down here?
formation of, eyeballs and your different nervous systems as you're of a
And these
whole
hands.
creature that you're bearing on the inside, how that could be, replicated externally, and with no scientific possibility beyond what I hope and imagine such a complex structure could be.
There's another little critter taking shape up here. I had missed that one before.
Yeah, there's lots of moments that are sort of forming and, about to drop, I guess.
Particularly, this is particularly beautiful, I must say. This is one of my faves. So definitely there's something about erotic energy in the work. And that is, that's something we don't see all that often expressed with this kind of fluidity and spontaneity and delicacy as we do in your work. It's a very distinguishing feature of what you do.
Yeah, I mean, with this one, there's more again of that imagination of that blend of hair being the sort of organic element of nature. And as sort of the work develops, like it kind of that, I guess that sort of mark making continuously calls back to that, and how things that look like plants are also look like they're woven from these sort of silken threads, or which is actually, mark by mark
almost
of drawing, and how it also echoes like fascia of like muscles and everything from sort of the body and anatomy. So there is this sort of building of a world from these very elemental, organic things.
Because there is this feeling here of a kind of scientific diagrams of the human body and muscle structure and so on. So it kind of borrows in a very oblique way from like medical illustration as well. Yeah. Well, Winnie, thank you. And we couldn't restrain ourselves from putting a close-up of one of your beautiful works on the cover of our book, which just came out last week. And I just wanted to share, the list of writers in this show is, in this publication. It's really wonderful, with Ruth Jones on Shary, Boyle, John Gagan, my colleague on Havavau, Jody Berland on Bill Burns, Jan, as I mentioned before, on Carrie Allison, Allison Cooley. Winnie wrote beautifully about your work, and Kyle McClear. So it was great to, pull together so many wonderful voices to kind of, explore the work and our kind of relationship to it. And I wanted to point out as well, like another project kind of came along at the same time as Uses of Enchantment, which was the opportunity to work with Sandra Meigs, who's a fantastic sort of, I suppose we could say, senior artist. She's 70 this year, who lives in Hamilton, and she's been making work about being in the landscape for many decades actually now. And during COVID, Sandra started spending time in Algonquin Park. And Jessica Bradley, who's the curator of this show, which opens this weekend, and we have a talk, as you see here, at 11:30 on Saturday morning, became aware of this and knew that we were going to be organizing a major exhibition of Tom Thompson that's opening on June 24th. And she was like, you should know that Sandra Meigs has been in Algonquin Park making the most spectacular drawings, but gouache paintings, but they're about climate change. So I thought, what a perfect combination that would be with Thompson. So Sandra's works, which are very much about species loss, habitat loss, rising temperatures, and so on, are in the gallery at the same time as Uses of Enchantment. So, if you join us this weekend, we would love to see you at 11:30 in the morning on Saturday. We're going to talk with Sandra about her works, and then, as I said, the Uses of Enchantment show is already up, and so you can see all the works by the artists that we've talked about tonight as well. So maybe we'll see some of you at the gallery this weekend. But before then, Jen, I'm wondering if we have questions from the audience, and I can take us to the works that under discussion, if you give me the heads up.
Well, the Q&A and the chat are mainly full of expressions of appreciation for the work that we've shown and the insights that have come out of this conversation. And I share that. I don't even have any questions. I've just been in the thrall of each person's insights about their own work and about the points of intersection. I was struck by, and this is perhaps a very obvious observation, but I was struck by how a through line in your work, all three of you, is about the delicacy, of materials, and a kind of a devotional approach to something that is very fragile, and a meticulousness to approaching something with such care. And the kind of irony of that in the context of dealing with sort of cataclysmic forces of environmental dysfunction. It's a very beautiful relationship
between all of the works. And I think, when I think about it, I think it's a resistance to, in that hand making, I see a real resistance to capitalism and to like the mass production of crap that we then throw out. And that, I just know even my own daughter's resistance to like, buying clothing as opposed to recycling things. Like there's a relationship to material culture that is principled, and I feel like the delicacy of the making of these things, the investment of time in the thought, is actually resistance to mass production. I suppose art making always is, but it's taken to such an extraordinary extreme in these works that it becomes almost like a political act of resistance to make that bat. Let me take us back to the bat.
One person asked about process and whether and maybe this is a question each of you might feel you want to speak to. The question is about whether a great deal of planning goes into executing works, or whether there is an element of discovery along the way. And I imagine the answer might be different for each of you, but if you're moved to answer that, I know I'd be curious.
Do you improvise, for example, like Winnie, when you're making one of those dioramas, do you kind of improvise as you go, or is it all planned out, or how do you go into a zone? Do you do them all in one day?
I get to truly experiment in that way. And if you know my previous work with the large scale sort of drawing, it was more a matter of sort of executing a almost quite clear idea in a study of where I want to go, because it is so labor intensive and there isn't room for play in the same way. As I'm really working with these almost paper doll elements where I'm kind of exchanging different, I guess, plants and figures from different environments. And sometimes the ground doesn't work with this sort of background, and every sort of articulation of a limb, like a folding of a finger, can create a different gestural outcome. And because of the infinite possibilities of that process, that's where my animation work also comes in, because I'm constantly minutely making these movements. I'm losing these entire narratives and play and moments in these dioramas where I have to decide at one point, these are fixed, these are done, and they need to be adhered as the singular image. And the animations I get to play with in a way that, captures in a smaller time what a moment in these dioramas might be. So, yeah.
How about you, Shary? What is this? Oopsie, you've got you're muted.
Yeah, here I am. I don't think it would be art if it wasn't a mixture of improvisation as well as planning. If you're just executing something that's perfectly planned, it's almost kind of dead before you start it. I don't know. I would say that any material process, if there's risk involved, is always going to lead you down a path you didn't expect. And then you're responding to that. And then if you're receptive and in the present, then you're kind of letting the work start to lead you where it wants to go.
I'd have to say you're the queen of high risk. Looking at this work here, for example, like how do you put that in the kiln? Oh, God.
Yeah. There's a lot of a lot of faith and acceptance.
Yeah, whatever the outcome will be.
Mm.
How about you, Carrie?
This is gonna sound funny after Shary's comment. Mine is like totally planned.
Totally planned.
I plan things out all the time. It's my
Yeah.
comfort zone.
Mhm.
The only thing I really play with it, like while I'm making it, is like different bead colors. So those are the only
Right.
sort of, like spaces where I get to like move things around.
Yeah.
I'm like a process-driven person. I do a
Mm.
lot of research at the beginning of every project. That research can look like lots of different things, but
Yeah.
do a lot of research, and then like there's like a small amount of planning, and then execution is like, because beadwork takes so long, that
Mhm.
that's how I've found that like I have the most sort of I'm a very anxious person. I have a lot of anxiety, and like beading has always helped me kind of like feel okay because I'm doing
Mhm.
something that's like quote unquote like productive.
Mhm.
But it's like a slow thing, and it's meditative and like just genuinely good for my health. But I am,
Like
yeah, I'm a total planner, so there's no there's no play.
soothing for climate anxiety. Yeah. 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 Beautiful. Jen, are there any
So
more questions tonight, or are
I
we?
think that's a nice place to end off. And I'd like to say, Winnie, Shary, Carrie, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I know that, well, Sarah, you'll correct me, but I think one of our aims with our program is to have people see the world in a new way after experiencing one of our exhibitions. And I know that is going to be very deeply felt by visitors to this show. Artists are seeing the future and showing us the way, and I think this show exemplifies that beautifully with your work. So thank you for your work on this show and with us on the book, and for being with us tonight. To our audience, thank you very much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this last hour and a bit as much as I did. Please come and visit us. We're open Tuesday to Sunday. There's a great program, as Sarah mentioned, on this weekend. Your donation supports the Art of Canada. You can scan that QR code and become a member, or buy the book that accompanies this show through our online shop, or pick it up when you come and visit us. That's it for now. Thanks very much.
I'll look
Good
forward
night,
to seeing you
everyone.
soon.